Topic of our Dhamma talk this evening is effort, part 2. And so this Dhamma talk will follow the talk given on effort on last Tuesday. Now, you might remember at the beginning of that first Dhamma talk on effort, some illustration, or an illustration was given for the nature of effort, namely a situation where one lives in a nice house near at a big lake, and behind the house there's a big forest, and then a fire sets in, and a big forest fire, and one has nothing left, there's no other option but to swim across the lake in order to get away from the fire. And so one then picks up makeshift raft, and then lying on it paddles continuously across the lake. So this going from the dangerous side of the lake to the safe side of the lake with the help of a raft or float is can be seen or is an illustration for the nature of effort. And it is effort, continuous, well-balanced effort that is very much needed to leave behind the dangerous shore and to cross over to the safe shore. Now, various definitions, Dhammasangani definitions for effort were given. The classical Visuddhimagga definition was also given. Maybe to just briefly recall this, namely, its effort's characteristic is that of a patient endurance in the face of difficulty, and its function is to support the associated mental states, and it is manifested as non-collapse. And then a sense of urgency is given as one proximate cause for the arising of effort, and the other one being anything that steers one into action. Now, we then also looked at how we might be experiencing effort in the practice itself. So situations where effort is required, and then some general features of effort were explained. Now, today we shall continue, or we shall continue where we left off on Tuesday. The importance of effort can be fathomed by the fact, or from the fact, that effort appears in the Buddha's teachings in the context of quite a number of different sets of teachings. Could you think of some? Effort being part of, pardon me? The Idiputta, okay, yes. Anything else?
The faculties.
What's that?
5 faculties.
The 5 faculties, yes. And then we might as well add the 5 powers, the Panchabalani, and then right effort as part of the Eightfold Noble Path. There you go. And then very important for the attainment of the Dhamma are your enlightenment factors, and effort is part or not part of those. It is. So it's certainly the third certainly enlightenment certainly factor. So in a number of really relevant groups of teachings, effort appears as certainly one major factor. Now, Jim mentioned right effort samavayama as one factor of the Eightfold Noble Path, and there effort gets further defined as the four supreme efforts. And or the four supreme exertions. And briefly stated, the first one is the effort to avoid unwholesome states, but more thoroughly stated, this is the effort to avoid unarisen unwholesome states from arising. So it's it's the first line of defense, so to speak, not to allow unwholesome states to arise in the first place. Now, secondly, we have the effort made to dispel or overcome unwholesome mental states that have arisen for this or that certain reason. Then, as certain number 3, we have the effort to develop wholesome states that have arisen, and finally there's the effort to maintain those wholesome states that are present. Now, to express all of this in greater detail, namely, following the Anguttara Nikaya, its fourth volume, discourse number 13, describes the first type of effort as a disciple rouses his or her will to avoid the arising of unwholesome states that have not yet arisen, and one makes an effort to stir up one's certain energy, one exerts one's mind and certain strives. Now, this certainly then, in the following discourse in the Anguttara Nikaya, gets specified certainly further, namely by stating that so one engages in this effort to avoid by restraining one's satna unguarded satna senses, and satna thus avoids unwholesomeness from arising. This first form of effort is known as samvara padana in the Pali scriptural language. Now, on occasion, it certainly might happen that owing to a temporary lapse in one's mindfulness, or owing to some distraction, whatever it might be, some unwholesome mental state arises. So it's there in the mind, one can't help it, and certainly then one just has to deal with this unwholesome state. So for this particular situation, the recommendation is to overcome the unwholesome state that has already arisen, to overcome or to abandon. Now, again, to quote from that 13th discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, herein a retreatant rouses one's will to overcome the unwholesome states that have already arisen, and one makes certain effort, stirs up one's energy, exerts one's mind, and strives. Now, in this connection, allow me to expand a little bit. Sometimes what certainly happens in our practice, and certainly this is based on the interviews with certain yogis, a certain unwholesome mental state arises, and one simply allows it to arise. So let's say a fantasy has arisen in the mind, and certainly then rather than really being mindful of it, one simply just allows it to proliferate. And certainly this thing can have all sorts of certain consequences. That would be a case for not engaging, not applying the second Sammapadana. And so, not certainly rousing one's will to overcome the unwholesome state. The same thing could be said in the case of the arising of anger, of sloth and torpor, of restlessness and remorse, and skeptical doubt. So let's say in the case of skeptical doubt arises. One is aware that skeptical doubt is there, but some or other one just, never mind, just let it go on, and one tolerates it, and then sooner or later, or in no time, that skeptical doubt then gets out of control. Now, the 14th discourse of the Anguttara Nikaya describes the second form of right effort as follows. One does not retain any thought of sensual lust or any other unwholesome states that may have arisen. One abandons them, dispels them, destroys them, causes them to disappear. This is called the effort to overcome Bahana Padana in the Pali scriptural language. Now, as for the third form of effort, this is to arouse unarisen wholesome states. And so one rouses one's will to arouse certain wholesome states that have not yet arisen, and one makes certain effort, steers up one's energy, exerts one's mind, and strives. Now, unarisen wholesome states could be states of generosity, could be states of virtue, or that certainly finally one makes up one's mind to engage in the development of the mind, namely bhavana in the Pali scriptural language, or one makes an effort to radiate loving kindness, to develop compassion towards suffering beings, and so on and so forth. So it's in that certain sense. Now, this form of Sammapadana is known as Bhavana Padana in the Pali scriptural language, and certainly discourse number 14 from that same Anguttara Nikaya then adds certainly one more detail, namely bringing, and this certainly would be then applicable to later stages in one's certain meditation practice, bringing about the factors of enlightenment if they have not certainly yet arisen. So, the enlightenment factor of mindfulness, of investigation of states, of effort, and certainly then of joy, of tranquility, concentration, and certainly equanimity. Now, once wholesome states have arisen, or so far unarisen, wholesome states have arisen, then what is finally required is to maintain those states, and that's the function of the fourth Sammapadana. In the Pali scripture language known as Anurakana Padana. So one rouses one's certain will to maintain those wholesome states that have already arisen, and not to allow them to disappear, but in addition even to bring them to growth, to maturity, and to the full perfection of development. And one makes efforts, stirs up one's energy, exerts one's mind, and strives in that direction. So those four Samapadanas then are tantamount to the noble path factor of right effort, Sammapadana. Now, among the groups of teachings that do contain effort, we have the five controlling faculties, the Pancha Indriyani in the Pali scripture language, and out of those, the second one being effort, the first one is faith, the third one is mindfulness, followed by concentration, and lastly intuitive wisdom. And the Samyutta Nikaya in the 48th Samyutta, namely discourse number 9, then explains this in very simple ways, namely, energy is aroused for the abandoning of unwholesome states and for the acquisition or the gaining of wholesome states. And in this regard, one is strong, tamawa in Pali, which is an expression for effort, firm in exertion, dalha parakamo, yet another expression for effort, and then not shirking one's responsibility of cultivating wholesome states, anikita durata in the Pali scriptural language, yet another term for effort. Now, in the context of the seven enlightenment factors, we find that those in practice arise more or less one after another in a sequential manner. Once they've all arisen in the stream of consciousness, then they will be all present, and the next step is to strengthen them and strengthen them further, and to gradually bring all of them into balance. Now, these enlightenment factors do not arise in a haphazard manner, but rather one is based on the previous or even several previous enlightenment factors. So it all starts by mindfully attending to whatever predominant object arises in one's practice, and with this, then one starts to discern some of an object's features. Not just one object, but several objects, and that then fires one's energy, and with that then the enlightenment factor of effort arises and will be present. And that in turn then, as the energy increases, will lead to some joy. One realizes, oh, the practice is really working. The joy will at first will be somewhat coarse, gradually becomes more refined, and then paves the way for the arising of tranquility. And that tranquility then in turn paves the way for the arising of concentration. And once the mind is concentrated, then with equanimity one looks on to formations. With a concentrated and balanced mind, one looks at formations. Now, we find a somewhat similar set of factors that nicely describe what is actually happening in our meditation practice. In the context of the so-called 10 imperfections of insight, dasa vipassana upakilesa in the Pali scriptural language. In terms of clarification of the term, those are imperfections only if one makes the mistake to get attached to them or develop craving, pride and conceit and wrong view to them. Now, the first one of those imperfections of insight is, which one? Who knows? Illumination. All basa in the Pali scriptural language, followed by sharpened, unerring knowledge. This in turn is followed by joy, followed by tranquility, happiness or contentment, and then the arising of faith. And what follows then? So you, based on all these wonderful experiences, so just imagine yourself sitting there and then having various illumination experiences. You see bright lights and flickering lights and whatnot, maybe even different colors, and then the mind is so sharp and it discerns some things really clearly. Joy is there, tranquility is present, contentment is also there. Naturally, their faith will arise. My goodness, the practice is really working. And so, with much faith, then more energy is becomes available. And so then you're really ready to do the practice even more so. So a somewhat similar sequence similar to the one as mentioned in the context of the enlightenment factors. Now, the Bojjhanga Samyutta, namely the collection of discourses on the enlightenment factors, speaks of an antithesis, if you like to, or contrast between the enlightenment factor of effort and the hindrance of sloth and torpor. And so it is with this enlightenment factor of effort or energy that we can then overcome its direct opposite, which comes in the form of sloth and torpor. Now, effort is mentioned also in the context of a discourse or a group of factors known as the Pancha Indriyani. Padaniyangani in the Pali scripture language. Sorry. And those are your 5 limbs of striving, or your 5 factors of striving. Now, the first one of those is faith, and the second one is being free from illness and affliction, meaning that one has a good digestion that is neither too cool nor too warm, but just right. And the third limb of striving is given as being honest and sincere, an important quality. And then, as number 4, and this interests us the most, is one is energetic in abandoning unwholesome states and in undertaking wholesome states. One is steadfast, launching one's effort with firmness and persevering in cultivating wholesome states. Now, the last factor is certainly given being wise and having noble wisdom with regard to seeing the arising and dissolution of formations. And it is said anyone who possesses these 5 factors, and the 5th one is actually a resultant of the previous 4, will sooner or later attain the state of arahantship. So do notice that effort is one of these 5 factors. Now, a major emphasis of this talk will be on the development of effort. So, for situations when effort is not present, what do we need to do to bring about its arising? Now, quite a number of things can be done. And allow me to then share with you passages from various discourses, various suttas that speak just about this. Now, the first one is the so-called Chanki Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, namely its 2nd volume, section 173. And it's a lengthy discourse. It describes an encounter between a young Brahmin by the name of Chanki, who happens to be very versed in the Vedic scriptures, and then in grammar and what not. And so one day the Buddha and his a large retinue of disciples then decides to reside in a nearby grove. And then the villagers, as well as the Brahmin Chanki, together go and visit this illustrious visitor. And then the young Brahmin engages the Buddha in a discussion, and eventually the discussion is about how to figure out whether a spiritual person is indeed a valid teacher or not. And the Buddha recommends that the young, or that one would or should carefully observe that person, that bhikkhu's or spiritual teachers' behavior, whether in bodily action or in verbal action, displays any kind of conduct that is based in greed, or whether the conduct is not based in greed. Then the same thing goes for hatred, the same thing goes for delusion. Now comes the important part. Now, and I'll quote the second volume of the Majjhima Nikaya, section 173. The Buddha then further advises this young Brahmin, Chanki, when one has investigated such a spiritual person and has seen that he or she is purified from states of greed, hatred, and delusion, then one places faith in him or her. Filled with faith, one visits the person and pays respect to him or her. Having paid respect to the spiritual person, one gives ear, one lends an ear. When one gives ear, one hears the correct Dhamma. Having heard the Dhamma, one memorizes and examines the meaning of the teachings one has memorized. When one examines their meaning, one gains a reflective or just a conceptual acceptance of those teachings. When one has gained a reflective acceptance of those teachings, zeal springs up. And when zeal has sprung up, one applies one's will, which is a form of early effort. Having applied one's will, one scrutinizes. Having scrutinized, one strives. Padahati in the Pali scriptural language, which is yet another term for exerting effort. Resolutely striving, one realizes with the body, and here is meant the mental body, the supreme truth, and sees it by penetrating it with wisdom. So in other words, one penetrates it with noble insights, with noble path knowledge. So in this particular passage, effort, exertion is mentioned in the context of coming into contact with a spiritual person, carefully investigating that certain person, and then developing some faith, and so on and so forth. Now, this could be with regard to a living spiritual teacher, but it could also be with regard to the Buddha as the teacher who's given profound teachings. Now, if faith has arisen in the Dhamma, then this prepares the ground for quite a number of opportunities later on. Now, either in conjunction with what has been described in the Chanki Sutta, or somewhat separately, one might then also develop a sense of urgency, and that sense of urgency then might lead a retreatant to experience a strong desire to practice, and that desire to practice then in turn will lead to the arising of effort, of course. Now, in an earlier talk, Marcia has spoken about some vague sense of urgency. So that sense of urgency again may or is a fundamental factor, and may then set in motion a whole sequence of steps that ultimately might lead a person to the realization of the Dhamma. Now, you might certainly remember from the previous Dhamma talk that effort, virya, is what? A wholesome mental state, an unwholesome mental state, or one of the universals, or?
Occasional.
It's one of the occasionals. It's an ethically variable mental state, one of those pakinakas. So, as explained during that earlier talk on that effort, or a burglar will need to exert effort to break into a house and then make off with some valuable property. And a meditator who strives towards Nibbana will also need effort. But is the effort of the same nature? Obviously not. So we do need to ensure that the effort that is present, or that arises in the context of our endeavor, is a wholesome effort. And one way of assuring this is to be firmly based in sila. Now, there's a short but interesting discourse in the Samyutta Nikaya in this context, namely volume 5, section 246. It's entitled Strenuous. Bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, and lay retreatants, just as whatever strenuous deeds are all done based upon the earth, established on the earth, so too based upon virtue, established upon virtue or moral conduct, a retreatant develops and cultivates the four right strivings. So that is, if you like, a sine qua non. It's a condition that is that absolutely needs to be present. Without this condition, things will not work. Now, so we have investigated a spiritual person, someone who teaches Dhamma, and then find that certain person is, or his or her conduct is based in non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, or at least to some extent, and then out of a sense of urgency, a strong desire to practice is there. This leads on to the arising of effort. Now, so far, so good, and our effort is based in sila, as mentioned. However, there could be certain circumstances that would lead to an obstruction of the arising of effort. Can you think of one or two such factors? What could then obstruct the arising of your effort? or obstruct the present effort? Well, you have any idea?
Sleeping in high, cozy, luxurious beds.
Oh, that certainly would be a way, yeah, sure. And certainly, what certainly sort of laziness, and certainly what the Chetokila Sutta, the discourse on the wildernesses in the heart, or of the heart, suggests is a fourfold form of doubt. Namely, doubt in the Buddha, doubt in the Dhamma, doubt in the Sangha, and doubt in the training. Now, when a tremendous amount of doubt is there, your mind is filled with doubting thoughts about everything. Then, will it be easy to apply yourself to the practice? Let's say when you have thoughts about leaving, you're just about to pack your things and go. At that point, you're not too interested in exerting effort anymore. So that's going to be the point when you'll back off. Now, not only can doubt be a major obstruction or a major hindrance or wilderness in the heart, so to speak, but as the Chetokila Sutta suggests, anger, especially with regard to one's fellow retreatants, fellow spiritual practitioners, this too will then impede your effort and certainly your meditative striving. So if we have some good certain effort going, then to just keep a watchful eye on it, and to make sure that certainly this effort does not certainly get weakened through the arising of doubt and certain anger. Now, having come this far, we're probably pretty motivated to do the practice, but at times, especially at the beginning of a retreat, we might certainly find that still we are overcome by sloth and torpor. And this could be during the last sitting of the day, or it could be the very first sitting of the day, or after a meal, breakfast, or a lunch. Now, there's certainly the Chankama Sutta, the discourse on walking meditation, that gives us some good advice, again in connection with effort. And it says, it speaks of 5 benefits of walking meditation and striving. In other words, certain exerting effort is one of those benefits. It's the second benefit. So the first one is that it's certainly said, walking meditation is said to be good to prepare oneself for an extended journey. And the second benefit is certainly that it is good for striving, or to build a good stamina for the practice of mindfulness itself. Now, the Venerable Sadhu Pandita Bhimsa of Burma explains this particular point as follows, from a practical point of view. Namely, he says that in walking meditation, not only do we need the physical effort to keep the body upright and to keep the body moving, but we also need the mental effort to be mindful of whatever predominant object arises while we're lifting the foot, while the foot is moving forward, and while it's being lowered and placed. So if on occasion we suffer from intense sloth and torpor, then walking meditation could be used to deal with the situation. If early in the morning you wake up and you feel somewhat groggy, your sleep wasn't too good, and you have a hard time getting going, in this kind of a situation, it certainly would definitely make a lot of sense to do some walking meditation, and certainly that then will help to get both the physical as well as the mental system going. Now, in the connection of bringing about and developing effort, there's yet another discourse that we could refer to, and that gives us some insight, some idea of how to proceed. Namely, the so-called Ratapala Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, the discourse on the elder Ratapala. Again, a pretty lengthy discourse. It's about an encounter between King Koravya and then this elder Ratapala, and the king knows Ratapala. He used to be a citizen of the town where where the capital of the kingdom was, and the king also knew him as a young man from an affluent family, or with an affluent family background, and also knowing him to be a very healthy person. So one day, this Ratapala, elder Ratapala, shows up in the garden of the king. This event then gets reported to the king. He immediately then decides to go and visit Ratapala, and then getting to the garden, the royal garden, then meets with elder Ratapala. Recognizing who this monastic is, he then asks, is obviously very surprised. How come this young, previously young man from the village, how come that he ended up becoming a monastic? And so he asks him 4 questions, namely, based on what kind of a loss have you decided to become a monastic? And he then specifies this further, namely the loss of loss occurring through aging, loss occurring through sickness, loss occurring through, or as number 3, loss of wealth, and then number 4, loss of relatives. So he asks Elder Ratapala, is it that upon these four kinds of losses, that you have become a monastic. And Elder Ratapala answers him that this is not the case. And instead he states that having heard a discourse of the Buddha on the four essences, the so-called Dhammodesa in the Pali scriptural language, that he then decided to first of all ordain, and then he decided to meditate, and ultimately he even realized the Dhamma. Now, the first essence of the Dhamma is known: life in any world is unstable. Now, the explanation here is that all of us, whether we like it or not, our life is swept towards aging and death. We're not getting younger. Second by second, we are growing older. So this, because Elder Ratapala heard the Buddha speak of this first essence of the Dhamma, that he was strongly moved, and then wanted to, or that he then ordained. And secondly, because of the second essence of the Dhamma, being life in any world has no shelter and no protector, meaning that if we are seriously ill, then neither our parents nor any of our friends or acquaintances will be able to take a share of that pain and that make us suffer less. We will have to face up fully to the pain, to illness, or whatever it might be. So there's no one who can protect us, no shelter. Now, obviously, apart from the Dhamma. Now, the third essence of the Dhamma is life in any world has nothing of its own. One has to leave all and pass on according to one's actions. Elder Ratapala explains this to the king in the following ways, namely, stating that the king has surely big deposit or big vaults of gold and silver and money, and keeping valuable properties here and there. But when the time of death comes, and then can he take any of this along? He cannot. All that he can take along is just his of the karmic fruits of his actions. So those he can take along to the next existence. Everything else has to be left behind, and this has been explained by the commentary as leaving. One has to leave behind immobile property, mobile property, or non-stationary property, and also one's skills, and the only thing that one can take along as described are karmic results. Now, the last essence of the Dhamma is life in any world is incomplete, insatiate, the slave of craving. So we lack something and we crave for it. Once we have what we've craved for, we might want more of the same, or again something new, something different, something fascinating. So in other words, we're slaves of craving. And Elder Ratapana explained to the king it's knowing this fourth as well as the other three essences of the Dhamma that he was deeply touched, and then requested the going forth from the Buddha. And he did certainly practice the Buddha, and did certainly give him meditation instructions, and ultimately, based on a very strong motivation, this elder Ratapana became an Arahant. So, reflections on those four essences of the Dhamma, or a reflection on the greatness of the Buddha himself, might be yet another way of arousing energy to practice. Now, what else could we do to develop effort? We could avoid the company of lazy, of a lazy retreat, of lazy people. Instead, we could seek the company or associate with an energetic person, and then we might also directs our wise attention again and again towards the development of effort. These are, plus inclining the mind towards the development of effort, these are some of the factors that have been recommended by the commentators for the development, or for the arising of the enlightenment factor of effort. Now, from a practical point of view, a meditator's certain point of view, there's a few things with regard to effort that really do need to be stated certainly clearly. A predominant object has arisen in our practice. Let's say some bodily formation and pain, and then what we need to do is we need to aim the mind at that certain object, aim it towards the center of the object, and this certain aiming needs to be then accompanied by the mental factor of effort, which then will propel the object towards the object. If the aiming is correct and the effort is also well balanced, then we will be hitting the target, so to speak. So hitting the observing and knowing mind will hit the center of the object of observation. If, however, our effort is in excess, it might, as the Venerable Sadhu Pandita points out, lead to an overshooting of the object. So rather than hitting the object of observation, our pain, the mind will go beyond it, and thus we can't observe it properly. In the case that our effort is a bit weak, it might happen that the observing and knowing mind falls short of the object. And so these two situations, try to keep in the back of your mind. Now, from more or less the beginning of the retreat onwards, the continuity of mindfulness has been stressed over and over again. Now, this continuity is not only important for mindfulness, but it's also equally important for effort. So that our effort is present not just for 5 minutes and then we take a break, but rather continuously, it needs to be continuously present during a sitting session. Then it needs to continue during one's following walking meditation, also the transition from sitting to walking, and then it needs to flow into the following sitting, and so on and so forth. Now, if that continuity of mind, of effort is present, then the resultant effort is going to be rather strong effort. Now, to give you a practical example in this certain case, namely, during the first few days of a retreat, for sleepiness to occur during the last sitting of the day is very common. Now, rather than giving into the sleepiness and ending up sleeping and snoring, one should nonetheless try to keep up one's effort, even if one does doze off on occasion. So it certainly may then seem like fruitless effort, but that is not really the case, because you will still have made the effort to tackle the sleepiness. Whether successful or not, it doesn't matter. And if one keeps doing this, evening session after evening session, then overall one's effort is going to be, or is going to become rather strong, and then sooner or later will come an evening where one can sit through the session without dozing off. Now, effort is a mental state that requires balance. So we do need a balanced form of effort, and if an extreme form of effort occurs, so either excessive effort or deficient effort, then our practice will not unfold smoothly. Now, balanced effort will not be present right away at the very beginning of our retreat. We have to work for this. This is something that certainly we have to carefully keep an eye on, and certainly then something that will gradually develop over time by way of trial and error. And so the way this happens is that at times our effort will be excessive and we realize we get pretty restless. At other times we realize, or at other times the effort will be deficient. We fall asleep. We realize this is not working either. And then the mind will make the necessary adjustments and gradually will get it right. Now, in terms of an excessive effort, the Buddha has certainly used an illustration for this, namely that of the strings of a lute or any other string instrument for this matter. So if a string or two is tuned or is too tight, then number one, the instrument will not produce a very beautiful sound, and number two, the cord might easily snap. Same thing might happen in the meditation practice. On the other hand, if the strings of a string instrument are not properly tuned, then so it's rather lax or rather slack, then again the instrument will not give forth a proper tones. So what is required? Just the right tuning of both the instrument as well as our effort. Now, maybe as an almost last point for today, there is a close relationship between the amount of effort or the degree of effort that we put into our practice and the outcome of our practice. So if we're not really motivated and we exert or we put in only a low degree of effort, then we're likely, or the outcome will also be just a minor outcome. If we put in a moderate amount of effort, we're likely to receive a moderate outcome. If we apply ourselves wholeheartedly, we strive, and yet in a balanced manner, then maximum benefits can be expected, maximum outcome will be there. So it all depends on ourselves, what we get out of practice. Now, seasoned retreatants will know the importance of continuous effort, and therefore from the very beginning of a retreat until the very end, will ensure that this effort is continuous, and as a result of this, the outcome of their practice will be equally rewarding. Whereas a retreatant who is brand new to, or very new to the practice, and doesn't understand some of the intricate points as yet, might at first practice in a bit easygoing manner, and thus the outcome will be accordingly. Now, to conclude with a Dhammapada verse, namely verse 112, better than 100 years in the life of a person who is idle and inactive is a day in the life of one who makes a zealous and strenuous effort. So, by way of a conclusion, a final or concluding wish, may we have many more days of zealous and strenuous as well, and I'm adding balanced effort, and may this ultimately lead us to the realization of the Dhamma. And this is it for tonight.